In the dark and uncertain years that followed the end of the First World War, Germany stood at a point of collapse. Its economy was broken, its national pride shattered, and its political system fractured beyond recognition. It was in this chaos that new powers quietly began to rise, powers that promised order, identity, and a return to greatness. And at the center of this rising storm stood a group of men who would eventually become the core of the Nazi elite. These men did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. Their beginnings were scattered, almost invisible at first. Former soldiers unable to adjust to civilian life, angry nationalists who blamed Germany's humiliation on outsiders, and ambitious individuals looking for power in a collapsing world. What united them was a shared frustration, a belief that Germany had been betrayed, and a hunger to seize control of the future. In smoky beer halls, in secret meetings, and on broken city streets, these early members of the Nazi elite slowly began to gather round a single voice: Adolf Hitler. Hitler's speeches drew them like iron to a magnet. But it was not only his passion that captured them, it was the opportunity he represented. Men like Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, Reinhard Heydrich, and other rising figures saw in Hitler the chance to build a new order where they could wield massive influence. Some admired his charisma, others his political strategy, and a few simply saw him as a tool for their own ambitions. Together, they formed a network of loyalty that was as dangerous as it was effective. Yet their rise was not just built on passion or ideology. It was built on planning, cold, calculated, and precise. They organized paramilitary groups, shaped propaganda, controlled communication, and infiltrated institutions. They used fear, manipulation, and promises of stability to win supporters. What the German public saw was a movement. What they could not see was the hidden machinery operated by the Nazi elite, working tirelessly behind the scenes. By the early 1930s, this elite core had transformed itself into an engine of power. They learned how to exploit political weakness, how to silence opposition, and how to turn a broken nation into a weapon. Their unity, discipline, and ambition created the perfect foundation for Hitler's dictatorship. And once they seized full control, they reshaped Germany and the world in ways history will never forget. This was just the beginning. The rise of the Nazi elite was not an accident. It was engineered. And in the chapters ahead, we will uncover how each of these men climbed into the inner circle that shaped the most terrifying regime of the 20th century. As Germany struggled through the early 1920s, the small circle forming around Hitler began to sharpen its identity. These men were not yet the feared figures history would remember, but their ambitions were already taking shape. They studied public frustration, observed political weakness, and understood that Germany's wounded pride could be used as fuel. Among them were individuals who would eventually become architects of terror, each with his own strategy, personality, and purpose. Heinrich Himmler, quiet and calculating, emerged as one of the most disciplined members of the group. Unlike the violent street fighters of the early Nazi movement, Himmler believed in building power slowly. Through organization and loyalty, he began forming strict structures, creating small units that would later evolve into the SS, one of the most feared organizations of the Nazi era. His methods were orderly, cold, and deeply ideological. To him, loyalty was not just a virtue, it was a weapon. Joseph Goebbels, in contrast, was a master of words. Where Himmler built systems, Goebbels built emotions. His speeches were carefully crafted to stir fear, anger, and hope all at once. He understood that people could be influenced not only by logic, but by feelings. Through newspapers, rallies, posters, and radio broadcasts, he perfected the art of shaping public perception. Goebbels' propaganda would later become the backbone of the Nazi movement, turning lies into weapons more powerful than bullets. Hermann Göring brought yet another dimension to the rising elite. A former war hero, he carried the charisma of a man who had tasted glory and wanted it back. Göring's boldness helped the movement gain attention, while his connections opened doors that others could not. He was ambitious, charming, and relentless, qualities that made him one of Hitler's most visible supporters. Then there was Reinhard Heydrich, perhaps the most dangerous of them all. A man of sharp intelligence and strategic brilliance, he operated like a chess player, always thinking several moves ahead. Heydrich's ability to identify threats, exploit weaknesses, and design operations would later earn him a reputation as one of the most feared officials in the regime. Even his rivals within the Nazi elite treated him with caution. Together, these men formed the early framework of a power structure that was steadily growing. While many Germans saw only political speeches and promises, the reality was far more calculated. Every meeting, every rally, every confrontation with opponents was part of a larger plan. The Nazi elite knew that Germany was desperate, and they used that desperation to tighten their grip. Their rise was still quiet, still unfolding, but the foundation had been set, and with every passing month, their influence grew stronger. The storm they were preparing would soon reshape history. By the mid-1920s, the Nazi movement was still small, but the ambitions of its rising elite were expanding faster than the party itself. What made them so dangerous was not just their ideas, but their ability to adapt. They carefully watched Germany's shifting political landscape, constantly learning how to turn weakness into advantage. As the Weimar Republic struggled with financial crises, political infighting, and public anger, the Nazi elite identified opportunities that others were too distracted to notice. One of their earliest strategies was the creation of paramilitary power. The SA, or stormtroopers, began as a loose group of street fighters, but under skilled organizers, they grew into a force capable of intimidation and disruption. Though loud and chaotic, the SA served an important purpose. They made the Nazi Party visible, feared, and impossible to ignore. Street clashes, marches, and confrontations kept the movement in the headlines. To the public, it looked like raw energy. To the elite, it was another tool of pressure. But beneath this loud exterior, the inner circle was already planning something more: refined structures that would give them long-term control. While the SA fought in the streets, Himmler focused on developing a disciplined group that answered only to the leadership. His growing organization took notes on opponents, documented supporters, and organized loyal members with military precision. This separation of chaos and control became one of the Nazi elite's defining strategies. At the same time, Goebbels recognized that a movement could not survive on violence alone. It needed a message that felt like truth, even when it wasn't. He experimented with speeches, newspapers, posters, and carefully staged events. His goal was not just to inform people, but to emotionally bind them to the cause. Through exaggeration, selective storytelling, and dramatic symbolism, he began crafting a narrative in which the Nazi Party appeared as Germany's last hope. People who felt helpless began to listen. Financial support also became crucial. The elite quietly sought alliances with industrialists, businessmen, and conservative influencers who feared communism more than extremism. Gring, with his charm and social connections, played a major role in opening those doors. The money that arrived didn't only fund rallies and uniforms. It funded the machinery of influence, presses, vehicles, meeting halls, and strategic campaigns. By the late 1920s, the Nazi elite had transformed their small movement into a complex system with multiple layers: violence on the streets, strategy in the shadows, and propaganda in the public eye. Germany was still resisting them, but the cracks were widening. What the world did not yet realize was that this group was preparing for a political breakthrough that would change everything. The storm was gathering. They just needed the perfect crisis to complete their rise. By 1929, Germany faced a crisis that would reshape its political destiny. The Great Depression. Factories shut down, banks collapsed, and millions found themselves suddenly unemployed. Desperation spread like wildfire, and in that desperation, the Nazi elite saw the opportunity they had been waiting for. While most political parties struggled to respond, the elite acted quickly, transforming economic chaos into a powerful weapon. Goebbels launched a wave of propaganda that targeted fear, confusion, and anger. Posters, speeches, and newspapers painted a picture of Germany on the edge of total collapse and the Nazi Party as the only force capable of restoring stability. He knew that in times of panic, people stop searching for perfect solutions and start searching for strong ones. His messaging was simple but emotionally charged, promising jobs, unity, and national pride. For many suffering Germans, it was a message they desperately wanted to believe. Meanwhile, Hitler intensified his public appearances. Huge rallies became common, each one staged with military precision. Flags, uniforms, marching formations, and dramatic lighting created an atmosphere that felt less like politics and more like destiny. The Nazi elite understood the psychological power of spectacle. They used it not only to recruit supporters, but to make their movement appear inevitable, as if resistance was pointless. Behind the scenes, the elite continued building alliances with influential figures who were losing faith in the struggling Weimar Republic. Conservative leaders, business magnates, and military officials began to view the Nazi Party as a tool to control the growing chaos. They underestimated the elite's true intentions, believing they could be managed once in power. This miscalculation would prove disastrous. Himmler and Heydrich also expanded their intelligence networks during this period. They quietly collected information on political opponents, tracked activists, and mapped out potential threats. These early surveillance efforts were small compared to what would come later, but they provided the elite with an advantage no other political movement possessed: preparation. They knew who stood against them long before those individuals realized they were being targeted. The SA, though undisciplined, continued to grow in size and aggression. Street violence reached new heights, creating a sense of instability that the Nazi elite used to their benefit. Every confrontation, every clash, every riot fed into their message that Germany needed strong leadership. The public often blamed the government for failing to control the streets, exactly the impression the elite wanted to create. By 1930, the Nazi Party's rise was no longer quiet or hidden. Their vote surged, their influence expanded, their leaders gained confidence. What had begun as a fringe movement now stood on the threshold of real political power. And for the elite, by the early 1930s, the Nazi elite stood closer to real power than ever before. Their strategy had shifted from gaining attention to gaining control. Germany's political system was weakening, divided by constant elections and unstable coalitions, and the elite recognized that chaos inside the government could be as useful as chaos on the streets. Their goal was no longer influence, it was authority. The turning point came during the elections of 1932, when the Nazi Party emerged as the largest political force in Germany. They did not win a majority, but they won enough seats to become impossible to ignore. This victory gave the elite something far more valuable than legislative power: credibility. Even those who disliked them were forced to take them seriously. Newspapers, diplomats, and business leaders began treating the movement as a major national force, and the elite used this new status with precision. Hermann Göring played a key role during this period. His position in the parliament allowed him to manipulate debates, block government actions, and create the impression that the existing political order was collapsing. Every failure of the Weimar government became a reason to support the Nazi Party. The message was simple: the system is broken, we can fix it. Behind the scenes, conservative politicians believed they could use Hitler and his circle as tools. They thought that by offering them positions in government, they could control the movement and use its popularity to stabilize the country. What they failed to understand was that the Nazi elite had no intention of being controlled. They wanted legitimacy. And once inside the system, they planned to reshape it entirely. The final push came through careful negotiation, pressure, and political maneuvering. Businessmen fearful of communism urged the president to bring the Nazi Party into power. Advisors argued that Hitler could be contained with the right restrictions. The elite encouraged these beliefs, pretending to be reasonable while hiding their long-term plans. On January 30, 1933, the moment they had engineered arrived. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. For many, it seemed like a political compromise. For the Nazi elite, it was the door they had spent years trying to open. The celebrations in public were loud and dramatic. But the real excitement was within the inner circle. They understood what most Germans did. Not that this appointment was not an end, but the beginning of their true rise. From within the government, they could now access resources, issue directives, and dismantle opposition legally. Power had shifted, quietly and strategically, into their hands, and they were ready to use it with speed and precision. Once Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, the Nazi elite wasted no time turning political opportunity into absolute control. What the public saw were ceremonies, announcements, and promises of national renewal. What they did not see was the rapid and coordinated strategy unfolding. Behind closed doors, a strategy designed not to share power, but to eliminate it everywhere else. The first target was the government machinery. Within days, Hermann Göring took control of the police in Prussia, Germany's largest state. This was a decisive move. With police authority in their hands, the elite could now silence political opponents legally. Under the guise of maintaining order, raids, arrests, and intimidation campaigns increased dramatically. Opposition newspapers were pressured, activists were watched, and meetings were disrupted. The elite were preparing the ground for something bigger. That opportunity arrived in February 1933, when the Reichstag building caught fire. The event shocked the nation, but for the Nazi elite it became a political weapon. They immediately blamed their political rivals and convinced the government to take emergency action. The resulting decree allowed them to suspend civil liberties, arrest opponents without cause, and restrict free speech. What looked like temporary security measures were in fact the first steps toward dismantling democracy. Goebbels intensified the propaganda machine, shaping public opinion with precision. Newspaper headlines screamed danger, radio broadcasts demanded unity, and posters portrayed the Nazis as protectors of the nation. He understood that fear made people more willing to surrender their freedoms, and he used that psychology to maximum effect. The elite were not simply gaining power, they were gaining permission. Himmler and Heydrich moved quickly to expand their intelligence networks. Lists of opponents grew longer, surveillance became more organized, detention sites were quietly prepared. These early forms of political repression were small compared to what would follow, but they marked the beginning of a vast system of control. The elite were building architecture that would soon dominate every aspect of German life. In March 1933, the Enabling Act was passed under tremendous pressure and intimidation. It gave Hitler and his ministers the authority to create laws without parliamentary approval. This single legal change effectively ended the Weimar Republic and opened the door to dictatorship. The elite had achieved what they had planned for years: unrestricted authority. With the old political system dismantled, the Nazi elite now faced a new challenge: not taking power, but shaping it. Their vision for Germany required complete loyalty, centralized control, and the elimination of any resistance. The transformation of the nation had begun, and the inner circle was prepared to push it further than anyone imagined. With the Enabling Act in place, the Nazi elite moved swiftly to reshape Germany into a one-party state. Their method was systematic: eliminate rivals, secure institutions, and build structures of loyalty. Every action taken in 1933 and 1934 was part of a carefully coordinated plan to ensure that no force, political, social, or military, could threaten their growing power. One of their earliest moves was the destruction of political opposition. The Communist and Social Democratic parties were targeted first. Their members were arrested, their offices seized, and their newspapers shut down. What had once been major political forces disappeared almost overnight. The Nazi elite understood that a dictatorship could not survive alongside competing voices, so they made sure those voices were silenced before they could react. Trade unions were next. The elite recognized that organized workers held significant influence in German society, so in a single coordinated operation, known as the Day of National Labor. Union leaders were arrested, union offices were taken over, and all workers' organizations were merged into a single state-controlled group. By removing independent labor power, the elite gained control over millions of citizens' livelihoods. At the same time, Goebbels intensified propaganda to transform not only politics, but everyday life. Radios became common in households, playing speeches and carefully crafted broadcasts that promoted unity and loyalty. Films, posters, school materials, and public ceremonies all carried the same message. The nation must follow its new leadership. The elite wanted control, just of actions, but of thoughts, emotions, and beliefs. However, the greatest internal challenge came from the SA, the same paramilitary force that had once helped the Nazi rise. Its leader, Ernst Röhm, demanded more influence, especially over the army. This created tension within the elite, particularly with Himmler, Heydrich, and Göring, who viewed the SA's independence as a threat. They understood that the loyalty of the professional military was essential for long-term control, and Röhm's ambitions jeopardized that relationship. Through careful planning, the elite turned this conflict into an opportunity. They gathered evidence, real and exaggerated, to portray the SA as dangerously unstable. Secret meetings took place, alliances were reinforced, and the final decision was made: the SA leadership had to be removed. This internal crisis would soon explode into a violent purge, one that would reveal just how far the Nazi elite were willing to go to secure absolute power. It would also show that their greatest enemy was not always outside the movement. Sometimes it was within their own ranks. The stage was set for one of the most decisive and ruthless actions in their rise. By mid-1934, the conflict within the Nazi movement had reached a breaking point. The SA, once a crucial force behind the party's rise, had grown too large, too aggressive, and too independent. Ernst Röhm's demands for greater military power alarmed the army leadership and deeply threatened the inner circle of the Nazi elite. Himmler, Heydrich, and Göring saw an opportunity not just to remove a rival, but to reshape the balance of power within the regime itself. The elite began preparing carefully. Heydrich's intelligence network collected reports, some accurate, others distorted, suggesting that Röhm planned a rebellion. These documents were secretly shared with military leaders, who already distrusted the SA's unruly behavior. The goal was simple: make the army believe that the only way to avoid chaos was to support a decisive purge. Goebbels, in his own quiet way, prepared the public mood. Newspapers highlighted SA misbehavior, describing them as disorderly and unprofessional. What ordinary citizens saw as sudden criticism was actually part of a coordinated plan. By the time the purge was ready, many Germans had already begun viewing the SA as a destabilizing force rather than a protector. On June 30, 1934, the Nazi elite launched what would be remembered as the Night of the Long Knives. In a series of rapid, pre-planned operations, SA leaders were arrested, isolated, and executed without trial. Röhm himself was captured and later killed. The violence spread beyond the SA. Anyone the elite viewed as a political threat or rival was also targeted. Old enemies, critics, and even some conservative figures were eliminated. The message was unmistakable: no one, not even original allies, was safe from the inner circle's power. The purge changed the landscape of the regime. The SA's influence collapsed overnight, while the SS, led by Himmler and Heydrich, rose to become one of the most powerful institutions in Germany. Their control over security, intelligence, and policing expanded dramatically. The army, relieved to see the SA dismantled, pledged loyalty to the new order, unaware of how much power it had just handed over. In the aftermath, Goebbels crafted a narrative that portrayed the purge as a necessary act to prevent a national crisis. Speeches and articles framed it as heroic, decisive leadership that saved Germany from internal danger. Many citizens accepted this explanation, demonstrating once again how effectively the elite could shape public perception. The purge accomplished more than eliminating rivals. It solidified the authority of the Nazi elite. Their power was now absolute, uncontested, and deeply entrenched. What had once been a fragmented movement had transformed into a tightly controlled hierarchy, with the inner circle standing unchallenged at its peak. And from this position of dominance, they began shaping Germany into the state they envisioned. After the Night of the Long Knives, the Nazi elite entered a new phase of their rule, one defined not by struggle, but by control. With political rivals eliminated and the SA neutralized, the inner circle could now shape Germany without internal resistance. Their next objective was to build a society that reflected their vision of absolute loyalty, strict hierarchy, and total obedience. One of the elite's first steps was transforming the police and security forces. The SS, now elevated above all other organizations, expanded rapidly. Himmler viewed the SS not just as a protective unit, but as an ideological force, a group that embodied discipline, loyalty, and unquestioning commitment. Under his leadership, the SS developed branches responsible for intelligence, policing, and eventually the administration of detention systems. Heydrich's role within the structure was crucial. His sharp intelligence and uncompromising methods turned these organizations into highly efficient engines of state control. At the same time, Goebbels intensified cultural and social influence. The Nazi elite understood that political power alone was not enough. They needed control over the hearts and minds of the population. Books deemed harmful were removed from libraries. School curricula were rewritten, and films were produced to promote unity and nationalism. Public events, ceremonies, and mass rallies created a constant sense of participation in a larger national mission. Through repetition and symbolism, Goebbels aimed to make the regime's worldview feel natural, even inevitable. The elite also targeted specific groups they considered opponents or outsiders. Early discriminatory laws marked the beginning of a system of exclusion that would grow increasingly severe. These measures were framed as legal reforms, but their purpose was clear: to isolate, restrict, and marginalize people the regime viewed as undesirable. Each step was carefully justified through propaganda, slowly normalizing discrimination in the minds of ordinary citizens. Economic policy also played a key role. The elite launched public works programs, infrastructure projects, and military expansion, which created jobs and reduced unemployment. These visible improvements increased public support, giving the appearance that the new leadership had rescued Germany from crisis. In reality, much of this growth relied on unsustainable spending and preparations for future conflict, but to many Germans, life seemed to be getting better, and that perception solidified loyalty. By 1936, Germany felt transformed. Streets displayed new symbols, youth groups marched in uniform, and the presence of the state could be felt in every aspect of daily life. The Nazi elite had succeeded in creating a system where opposition was nearly impossible, and conformity was rewarded. Their power extended into homes, workplaces, schools, and even private thoughts. By 1937, the Nazi elite had built a system so deeply rooted that it no longer relied on public approval alone. Their control extended across politics, security, culture, and education, but their ambitions were still growing. The inner circle believed that Germany needed to expand territorially, militarily, and ideologically. Their next phase would be defined not by internal consolidation, but by preparing the nation for confrontation with the outside world. The rearmament program became the centerpiece of this effort. Göring, placed in charge of the four-year plan, oversaw massive industrial expansion. Factories produced weapons, vehicles, and aircraft at an unprecedented pace. Under his authority, the economy shifted from civilian priorities to military preparation. While many Germans welcomed new jobs and national pride, the deeper goal was far more aggressive: to build the power necessary for future conflict. Himmler and Heydrich continued expanding the security network behind the scenes. Their forces monitored not only opponents but also ordinary citizens. using reports, surveillance, and informants to enforce ideological conformity. Trust between neighbors weakened as people feared being accused of disloyalty. This atmosphere of suspicion made resistance almost impossible. Even private conversations could lead to consequences, demonstrating how thoroughly the elite had penetrated everyday life. Goebbels worked tirelessly to shape public perception of Germany's growing assertiveness. Films, posters, and radio broadcasts portrayed the nation as strong, united, and rising from past humiliation. At the same time, the elite promoted a narrative of external threat, suggesting that other nations sought to weaken or exploit Germany. This combination of pride and fear created public support for expansionist ambitions. Many citizens believe that reclaiming lost territories or asserting dominance was necessary for national survival. Internationally, the elite tested boundaries, observing how foreign powers reacted, each small step defying treaties, reoccupying demilitarized areas. Forming alliances revealed that the world was hesitant to respond forcefully. This hesitation emboldened the inner circle. They concluded that bold moves could be made without immediate consequences, and their confidence grew. Meanwhile, internal pressures intensified. Policies targeting marginalized communities became harsher, laying the foundation for a system of systematic persecution. Laws restricted rights, careers, and daily life. These measures were presented as legal, orderly reforms, but they were part of a broader effort to reshape society, according to the elite's ideological vision. By 1938, Germany stood on the edge of transformation once again. Public support remained strong. The military was expanding, and the elite felt unstoppable. Their ambitions were no longer limited to controlling Germany, they aimed to reshape Europe itself. In the world the Nazi elite were building, controlling minds was as important as controlling armies. Their power did not rely only on guns, prisons, or fear. It relied on something far more dangerous. A system of organized indoctrination that entered every German home, every school, every workplace, and every moment of public life. This machinery of manipulation, designed and perfected by the Nazi elite, became one of their strongest weapons. At the center of this system stood Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, a man who understood the psychology of the crowd better than anyone else in Hitler's circle. He believed that truth did not matter, only the emotional impact of a message mattered. Goebbels created a propaganda empire so vast that no German could escape it, even if they wanted to. Radio became one of the most powerful tools. Cheap receivers called Volksempfänger, the people's radio, were placed in millions of homes. Citizens were encouraged to listen to Hitler's speeches, patriotic songs, and carefully crafted stories praising the regime. Dissenting or foreign broadcasts were banned. With radio, the Nazi message could penetrate every living room, turning personal space into political space. Then came film and newsreels. Directors like Leni Riefenstahl produced grand visual spectacles portraying Hitler as a heroic savior and the Nazi Party as a movement of unity and strength. These films were designed not as entertainment, but as psychological engineering, spectacle that triggered emotion, loyalty, and fear. Schools were turned into political training centers. Teachers loyal to the regime rewrote textbooks, reshaped history, and taught children to praise militarism and racial ideology. Youth organizations like Hitler Youth and League of German Girls completed this transformation, preparing a new generation that would never question authority. But the indoctrination machinery extended even further. The Nazis controlled art, literature, theater, music, and newspapers. Anything that did not fit their ideology was labeled degenerate and destroyed. Soon, Germans found themselves living in a world where every poster, every headline, every speech, and even every song carried the same message: loyalty to Führer, loyalty to nation, loyalty to the elite. The true genius and horror of this system was how smoothly it worked. Many people believed what they were told because the propaganda machine left no room for alternate truth. Lies repeated daily became reality. This was the silent battlefield where the Nazi elite operated. the battlefield of the mind, where control was achieved not through force alone, but through total domination of information. If the Nazi elite were the brain of the regime, then the Schutzstaffel was its iron spine. Under the command of Heinrich Himmler, the SS became more than just an organization. It evolved into a state within the state, operating with its own laws, its own courts, and its own vision for the future of Germany. The SS began as a small group tasked with protecting Adolf Hitler, but Himmler transformed it into an elite force built on discipline, racial ideology, and absolute loyalty. To join, recruits had to pass strict physical examinations, racial purity tests, and background investigations. The SS did not simply want soldiers, they wanted ideal Germans as defined by their twisted ideology. Once accepted, SS men lived under extreme expectations. Their lives were carefully monitored: what they read, whom they married, how they behaved, even how they thought. They were forbidden from forming independent opinions or showing emotional weakness. Every part of their identity was shaped to serve the regime without question. The SS expanded into several branches, each with a specific purpose. The Waffen-SS became a feared fighting force, praised for its discipline but notorious for brutal actions on the battlefield. These units were trained to fight with fanatical loyalty, seeing themselves as the vanguard of a new order. But the SS was not only a military powerhouse. It controlled intelligence services, surveillance networks, and secret police operations. Agencies like the SD Sicherheitsdienst monitored the population, hunted political enemies, and identified anyone who might oppose Nazi rule. In many ways, the SS functioned like the eyes and ears of the regime, quietly tracking the thoughts and behaviors of millions. Perhaps the darkest role of the SS was its management of concentration camps. Under Himmler's direction, the SS built and operated a vast system of imprisonment, forced labor, and genocide. In these camps, cruelty was not random, it was systematic. SS officers were trained to show no mercy, no hesitation, and no compassion. The power of the SS grew so immense that even high-ranking government officials feared it. Himmler envisioned the SS as the future ruling class of a Nazi empire, a new aristocracy based on discipline, obedience, and racial ideology. By the late 1930s, the SS was no longer just a part of the government. It was a parallel government, one that answered only to Hitler and Himmler. Its shadow stretched across every town, every institution, and every aspect of German life. The SS was the ultimate symbol of the Nazi elite's ambition: total control, enforced through fear, loyalty, and unchallenged authority. Among all the instruments of Nazi power, none inspired more dread than the Gestapo, the secret police force responsible for crushing opposition and maintaining fear across Germany. While the SS was the muscle and ideology of the regime, the Gestapo was its invisible fist, striking silently and without warning. The Gestapo, led by Heinrich Himmler under the oversight of Himmler, operated almost completely outside the law. They did not require warrants, court orders, or evidence. A simple suspicion was enough to justify arrest. Once someone was taken, their fate often vanished into a maze of interrogations, prisons, and camps, sometimes never to return. What made the Gestapo truly terrifying was not their numbers. Surprisingly, the organization was relatively small compared to the size of the population. What made them powerful was their strategy: fear multiplied by surveillance. The Gestapo encouraged neighbors to report neighbors, co-workers to report co-workers, even children to report their own families. Anonymous letters, whispered accusations, and personal grudges all became tools in the machinery of fear. The Gestapo kept detailed files on countless citizens. They monitored mail, tapped telephones, and infiltrated political groups. Anyone who dared to criticize the regime, in private, risked arrest. People learned to watch their words carefully, even inside their own homes. Conversations became cautious. Trust evaporated. Inside Gestapo headquarters, interrogations were harsh and relentless. Their goal was not just to gather information, it was to break resistance completely. Methods ranged from psychological pressure to physical brutality. Many prisoners confessed. simply because they knew that resisting meant worse suffering. The Gestapo played a major role in enforcing racial policies. They hunted Jewish families attempting to hide or escape, tracked down people labeled undesirable, and helped organize deportations to ghettos and concentration camps. Their work was systematic, cold, and efficient. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Gestapo was how ordinary it made terror feel. Officers often appeared calm, organized, even polite. Their cruelty came not from wild rage, but from strict obedience. They believed they were protecting the state, following orders, and doing what was necessary. This made them even more dangerous. By the late 1930s, the Gestapo had become the most feared organization in Germany. People did not rebel because they believed the Gestapo was everywhere, listening to every word and watching every move. In reality, it was the belief itself, the paranoia they created, that gave the Gestapo its true power. This weapon of fear allowed the Nazi elite to maintain total control, crushing dissent long before it had the chance to grow.